Hello and welcome to another episode of Battlefield Breakdown. This episode will talk, of course, about the Ukrainian Kursk offensive. How does it compare to other offensives? Whether it is an offensive or a raid, or an offensive that might turn into a raid, and whether Ukrainians are completely crazy attacking the Russians where they're not strong. Shouldn't they attack them somewhere in the Donbass or in the south where the Russians are the strongest? Why this makes sense or doesn't make sense, all this will be part of this episode. So first I talked about offensive and raid. And what is the difference between a raid and an offensive? A raid is a temporary attack, usually to influence the opponent by the shock it creates. It lives off the element of surprise. It attacks the enemy in its rear where it is weak, where the enemy did not expect to be attacked at all. And it's of temporary nature. It does not set to create permanent conditions, such as occupying land or completely destroying enemy forces. Usually it is associated either with naval warfare, where, for example, English pirates have raided Spanish settlements in the Caribbean and elsewhere in Latin America to capture gold or to surprise Spanish ships in harbor to destroy them, to steal other treasures and attack treasure ships. It is usually associated with commando forces, so you have raids to liberate hostages, raids to kill people like Osama bin Laden. That was a perfect raid in 2011 by the Americans. Israelis conducted numerous commando raids across several borders to liberate hostages, kill somebody. This is basically what you do with a raid. It's a very short operation to kind of make a point, get a very specific objective and then get back. However, because it's usually associated with very small forces, nobody thinks that you can raid with pretty large and substantial forces as well. Why not? I'll give you an example. In the 7-Year War, the Austrian cavalry general Hadik took Berlin. Yeah, he took Berlin. Of course, not for a long amount of time. He captured the city for roughly 3 days, plundered, of course, the cashier and the municipal treasure, and then went on and moved away because major Prussian forces under Frederick II, whom the Germans called the Great, went northwards and tried to catch and expel him. He did that with basically 5,000 cavalrymen. That is more substantial than a usual commando raid, but it's of course not that substantial to really occupy Berlin. What did he achieve? Well, as I said, he didn't create permanent conditions, but psychologically he harmed the Prussians because Frederick then was directed a lot of remote northern cities to be fortified, to have their fortifications modernized from the kind of medieval city walls into proper star fortresses, fortify a lot of river crossings that the Austrians used unhinged. And that, of course, diverted a lot of money that Prussia needed to build up more artillery, to hire new soldiers, and diverted it into fortifications that were pretty useless for the point of the Austrian-Prussian confrontation in the 7-Year War, which was about Silesia and not about cities like Stettin at the time, or Stargard, that was fortified because of Hadik's raid. That didn't make sense for Silesia, but of course it made sense for preventing another Austrian raid onto rich merchant towns in Prussia's north. So that's what you want to do with the raid. You redirect enemy finances, you make the enemy paranoid, you make him embarrassed because catching the enemy's capital is something usually a bit embarrassing. You take something away from the enemy that the enemy likes to have. You capture equipment or soldiers or people and then you withdraw. Raids were actually, if we go closer to Ukraine and follow Ukraine's history, if you follow how the Ukrainian Cossacks maintained their independence from both Poland, Russia and the Ottoman Empire, raiding was a very important part of the Cossack states' military campaigns against each of their neighbors, because their neighbors were all bigger than them. Neighbors had much larger, substantial armies, and of course the Cossacks couldn't just go into a field battle and challenge them with line infantry, but they were more mobile, more motivated, cohesive, so they tried to bother them elsewhere and punch above their weight to keep them away. Also because the Cossacks financially, of course, couldn't compete, for example, with the Ottoman Empire, but of course you could still steel artillery you were not able to afford yourself, and you can take them away, and the Cossacks were very successful throughout the centuries doing that. Or even substantial rights are not something you should kind of dismiss as something not proper or not conducive to the Ukrainian current situation. I will later on refer to that. What is the difference to an offensive? An offensive wants to create facts on the ground that influence the course of the war, either deciding it or preparing the conditions to further attack or further advance or further defend in order to decide the war. Operatively significant, rights are tactically significant, offensives are operatively significant maneuvers. They intend to really have lasting impact on whatever the war will continue. And now this, what we see now, may be a raid and an offensive at the same time, and that very much depends on the political circumstances. So now, to the question, why does Ukraine conduct an offensive into the kind of empty space where Russia is weak? There are no substantial Russian forces to destroy, to capture, or not the proper Russian center of gravity forces that are fighting in the Donbass. Why do you attack in the weak part of the enemy's armed forces, or in the weak part, in the sideshow of the enemy's war effort? Why didn't you maneuver? Why didn't you attack the enemy's center of gravity? Well, here I have to draw a distinction between land and naval war. The idea of moving or maneuvering against the enemy's center of gravity, against the enemy's real big echelons where the enemy has its most potent, most strong forces, is something that we see very commonly in naval warfare. The kind of decisive battle doctrine Albert Taylor Mahan was famous for is something that is very common in naval warfare, because you want to decide the command of the sea by taking out the enemy's battle fleet or the enemy's decisive fleet, whether these are carriers or ships of the line or battleships. That doesn't matter. It was from Lepanto to Trafalgar to the Battle of Jutland to Midway, it was always the kind of same concept. You strike the enemy as hard as you can wherever the enemy has a center of gravity, and then basically if you break the enemy, you have won the command of the sea and you will probably win the war. The problem is, land warfare is substantially different from naval warfare. In land warfare, I mean, the sea is equal to everybody. So if you are maneuvering at sea, there is no difference between you and the other fleet in terms of who can use the terrain. Sometimes, of course, if we think about coastal battles or littoral combat, of course, terrain plays a role, but usually it does much less than in terms of land warfare. Why is that important? Because the supposedly winning side can be determined by the strength of the fleet, much easier than at land, where the winning side can, or often is not, the numerically or on paper format stronger military force. In land, the defensive holds a particular advantage in allowing the defender to prepare the terrain, to deny the enemy the access of certain parts of its country by very strong fortifications, for example, tying down substantially larger forces in defensive battles and grinding them down and destroying them. In the open ocean, the bigger fleet wins. If you're the smaller fleet, you stay at home, you are a fleeting being, you don't engage the enemy. In a land warfare, you can't stay in port. There is no port to stay in, you have to fight. Hence, it is actually quite uncommon in land warfare to operate into the strength of the enemy. You try to delay it, you try to defend against it, but if you seek the initiative, if you seek to attack the other party, you're going for the weak spots. And that's actually the normal procedure. Ukrainians are doing nothing else but most of all successful generals that had successful offensive campaigns in the past. They identify the weak spot in the enemy's disposition and then seize the initiative and attack there. You can basically number numerous campaigns that have thought the weak spot of the enemy. Of course, Germany's Sicherschnitt, the attack through the Ardennes against the Franco-British forces in 1940, is the most famous ones, where they identified the Ardennes as the weak spot between, in the south, the Maginot Line, which was heavily fortified, and in the north, the disposition of the British Expeditionary Force and French mechanized forces, and you strike through the weak spot, encircle the maneuvering forces of the British and the French, and then basically you win the campaign. There are numerous others. Even if, for example, a force is numerically stronger, it will operate into the weak spot of the enemy. Remember General Schwarzkopf in 1990-1991 in the then Gulf War. Even though the coalition forces against Saddam Hussein were much larger, they did not attack just straight on into Kuwait and batter against the prepared defenses Iraqis have laid out.
Our plan initially had been to start over here in this area and do exactly what the Iraqis thought we were going to do, and that's take them on head-on into their most heavily defended area. Also, at the same time, we launched amphibious feints and naval gunfire in this area so that they continued to think that we were going to be attacking along this coast and therefore fix their forces in this position. Our hope was that by fixing the forces in this position and with this attack through here in this position, we would basically keep the forces here and they wouldn't know what was going on out in this area. And I believe we succeeded in that very well.
They went deep into the Saudi desert and outflanked the Iraqi forces by very far, and basically chased down from the rear into the Iraqi lines, who were completely surprised by what they saw, then had to reposition themselves. This repositioning was a difficult maneuver, caused chaos, allowed coalition forces to engage Iraqi divisions one by one instead of a cohesive force and destroy them. Even though, of course, they were the larger force, that didn't operate just into the blunt strength of the enemy. The same actually the Russians did at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. The best and most trained and strongest Ukrainian formations at the time were in the east fighting the war in the Donbass. And the fortifications there, of course, because of 8 years of war in the Donbass, were the strongest. Moscow did not capture cities like Mariupol from the east. They came from the western side through Crimea. The center of gravity of the Russian operation against Ukraine at the time was against Kiev, not against the Donbass, because they knew that there are the strongest forces. If we want to have a chance to decide that quickly, we go elsewhere. Well, the same applies to Ukraine now. There are very few examples where a general decided to operate into the strength of the enemy. Usually generals only do that if they are fully convinced that their forces are superior in quality, in quantity, and will win this. I could, from the bottom of my head, name only one battle. That was the Battle of Verdun, where the German Chief of General Staff Falkenhayn knew that Verdun was the center of gravity of the then French effort and front, and he thought that if he would advance onto Verdun and threaten the city, the French would throw everything at it, and by that attriting the French to the point they can't maintain the organized resistance against the Germans. It's a very much a war of attrition logic. Verdun, of course, did not play out the way Falkenhayn intended. It didn't work. And he was at the time quite well convinced that his forces were, especially in terms of quality, far superior over the French ones. Ukrainians have, of course, a qualitative advantage, but they know their severe quantitative disadvantage. So if they want to put pressure on Russia, they can't do that by conventionally operating into the Russian strength. I think the counteroffensive of 2023 was an excellent proof in concept that that doesn't work. And so, of course, Ukrainians are looking for other ways to reset the political landscape and get back into the initiative. Where the difference lies in between most past operations and current Ukrainian operations, that's less a military issue, that's a political issue. What do you intend to achieve by an operation? The previous examples, of course, it was quite easy to tell. 1940, the aim of the operation was, of course, to dislodge the Maginot Line, to encircle the maneuvering part of the Franco-British forces as much as you can, because then if you have destroyed and taken out these maneuvering forces, you can basically move on to Paris. If you move on to Paris, the your continental land enemy's capital, you are able to dictate the terms of the peace, which the Germans did then in the armistice, and you win at least the campaign against France. The same goes for General Schwarzkopf in 1990. You smash the Iraqi occupation forces in Kuwait, decisively destroy that, by that basically tie the hand to Saddam Hussein. He can't continue occupying Kuwait, and you restore the territorial status quo ante and leave no room for Saddam to change that in the immediate future. Also, if you look at the Russian war plan, of course, capturing Kiev would decide, in the Russian point of view, the war. It didn't, because they didn't capture it, but it was, of course, the plan. A very good example, actually, into maneuvering into the weak spot is, of course, Ariel Sharon in 1973, where he broke through in the intersection between the Egyptian Second and Third Army, broke through, crossed the Sinai, outmaneuvered the Egyptian forces, encircled the Third Army on the Sinai. You had the most capable enemy maneuver force pinned down by crossing the Sinai, going on the western bank of the Sinai Peninsula. You would have the opportunity to move on to Cairo, hence the enemy's forces are beaten and outmaneuvered, and you can seize again the political initiative to go for a settlement. In Ukrainians' case now, of course, the thing is different, because Kursk is Russian periphery. It is not the Russian capital, like Israeli forces having an ally to Cairo or the Germans chasing down on Paris. Also in Kursk, there are no sizable maneuver forces to encircle. I mean, there are, and Ukrainians are making good progress and they capture a lot of people, but it's of course not the bulk of Russian forces that if you encircle them, they will be unable to continue the war in the east. It's not a Schwarzkopfian cut them all off maneuver. So what is the purpose of it? President Zelensky gave in his previous speeches a lot of clues on what the objective is. First of all, to confuse the enemy.
Основне завдання наших оборонних дій загалом – знищити якомога більше російського потенціалу війни.
Like in a raid, you want to draw Russian forces, Russian attention elsewhere. You demoralize him. That's like in a raid. But also, like in an offensive, Ukrainians want to create what President Zelensky calls an exchange fund.
І проводити максимум контрударної роботи. Зокрема, це і створення буферної зони на території агресора, наша операція в Курській області.
There are a lot of worries in Ukraine that the war might end in a ceasefire, might have to end in a ceasefire because Western partners demand it. They become war weary. Russia continuously losing equipment. They might, in a couple of months or in a year, have or face serious problems continuing offensive operations like they do now, and then it would need a pause. If then you would have a kind of Minsk III ceasefire. Ukraine is not in NATO and has no clear path in NATO. We have discussed that prior to the NATO summit, why that is a problem for Ukraine to prevent another continuation war. On the other hand, Russia occupies large swath of Ukrainian territory, basically defers all other issues to a kind of diplomatic process. They can prolong and massage the West with negotiations which are just a cover to rearm and regun and buy new North Korean stuff and ammunition, and then try again like they did in the previous iterations of Minsk. Then Ukraine is in a pretty bad spot. You don't have a pressure point to force Russia into substantially negotiate. You are not secured by Western allies, and you're basically left at the mercy of their continued supply, which you expect to decline once the war is out of the news cycle. So how do you build up leverage against Russia? Well, occupy the territory. If Putin thinks he can freeze the war on the current front lines, and this is conveyed by people who are close to the Russian regime, that he might be at some point willing to freeze the lines where they are. We saw the news articles, and this might be attractive with new American president or European politicians. That is for Ukraine a real problem, because Putin just sort of freezing it and saying, well, you know, if you go 1 millimeter, you're the warmonger and I have your territory ransom and I drag you in negotiations wherever I want to because I have the initiative, that's not the place you want to be in. If, on the other hand, you have Russian territory, then the thing becomes an exchange process because Putin, even though he doesn't care for the periphery, just watch the Russian periphery, visit the Russian periphery, and you will see that in principle they don't care, but they care for the principle that Russia is not invaded and has lost territory. That is something you can use to either prevent a very unfortunate ceasefire agreement or make simple, I would not call them peace plans, but they're called peace plans by the people that propose them, that are very inelaborate ceasefire agreements, to foil that and to reset it, to insert an angle of agency, to influence such talks in your favor and to have a better say in it. And such talks are actually going on, not about a substantial ceasefire, but about partial ceasefires. There are a lot of intermediaries that try to insert themselves into negotiation processes behind the scenes that are very eager to, again, to promote this kind of ceasefire stuff. And that, from this political point of angle, because Zelensky, to continue to have Western military supplies, can't say, I won't negotiate. On the other hand, he can't negotiate purely on Putin's terms. So, again, reset the political playing ground. Will this last forever? And that's why I inserted my explanation about the raid. We don't know. Next American elections are pivotal, but we don't know where they will go to. We do not know which kind of advisors a new Mr. or Madam President would pick and what these advisors would suggest. It's fairly certain that the old administration, that key personnel from the current US administration will be leaving. So the whole necessity for Ukraine to actually take Russian territory and keep it for negotiations which might take place then later and later and later actually also might diminish. And then, of course, holding Russian territory where Russia can stretch out the front might be a political disadvantage for Ukraine. But at that time, actually, Ukraine can still declare, well, it was a raid, we took prisoners, we diverted Russian troops and made them look stupid. Now it's time to go because we don't want Kursk and we can just go home. That's possible as well. It might be prudent at some point, but that depends on the political circumstances the military offensive tries to influence. Under these circumstances, of course, the offensive makes sense. Of course, it's a risky maneuver. It's not risk-free. Russia at the time is not pivoting away from Kursk, is not pivoting away from New York, it's not pivoting away from Ocheretiny. We'll see how long they can afford to do that. We'll see who blinks first. We also have not seen the full commitment of Ukraine's operative and strategic reserves. They still could be committed to the Donbas instead of increasing the Kursk offensive. So we should at this point not be apoplectic and say this operation, the war will have to go into that direction. There is no other chance for Ukraine to do so. They still have cards in the sleeve and they can play them at one front or the other. We'll see where it goes. We should not charge the operation at the initial stage and say this is Operation X and this is exactly how it will go down, because Ukrainians are very flexible in their planning. They have still the time and the means to react the one or the other way. So I hope that was a bit useful on making sense of current operations against Kursk and why Ukrainians choose to do so. And with that, I hope you have a nice summer and enjoy some wine like I do in the background. And see you next time.